Okay, hello everybody. My name is Jaspal Singh. Welcome to our webinar. I will be your host today, but the introduction will be given by Lina and Carlos. Over to you, please.
Hi everyone and welcome. Welcome to this webinar, The Israel-Palestine Issue Comes to the OU, How to Facilitate Free Debate. Welcome, it's so great to see so many of you. Thank you for joining and thank you very much to our three speakers, Rebecca, Kristina and Les. Carlos Azevedo and I will be co-chairing this webinar as representatives of the Open University Ceasefire and Gaza Group. I'd like to highlight that although we are both affiliated with the Open University, we are doing this in a personal capacity. The views expressed do not represent the Open University as an institution, and we are not using OU resources. A few housekeeping points before we get started. Please could everyone apart from the speaker keep yourself muted so as not to interrupt the flow. If you'd like to ask a question, there will be time at the end for Q&A. Please could you type any questions in the chat as we go along, indicating it is a question by including a Q or question before it. We will be recording the first part of the webinar with the presentations and a link will be emailed to you afterwards, but the Q&A will not be recorded. I'd like to ask everyone to use respectful and tolerant language. We will not accept any form of discrimination or harassment, whether based on race, gender, sex, sexual orientation, beliefs, age, disability, religion, or socioeconomic background. We encourage anyone who has experienced or witnessed any form of discrimination or harassment during this webinar to come forward and tell us. To give some background for this webinar, the OU Ceasefire and Gaza Group was initiated as a 15-minute walkout in the Faculty of Wellbeing, Education and Language Studies in mid-November to call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. We decided to continue meeting on a weekly basis, opening up the meeting to the wider university to express how we felt and our views in relation to the horrific events occurring in occupied Palestine and Israel, and to discuss what action we could take as a group. Having Palestinian heritage myself, I found the past couple of months very painful, a mixture of grief, disbelief, anger, and survivor's guilt, although of course this is nothing compared to the intense suffering of the people of Gaza. It was a huge relief to be able to talk freely amongst like-minded colleagues after feeling for so long that I couldn't say anything at work, and feeling empowered to do something together with my colleagues. And I know that other colleagues within this group have felt similarly. We realized that many of us were scared of speaking up, of having false accusations of anti-Semitism weaponized against us, and so we decided to initially focus on building critical literacy to equip and to embolden us to more freely discuss the Israel-Palestine issue whenever it arises in our work or professional contexts or everyday life. Thank you. I'll hand over to Carlos.
Thank you, Lina. So the current war in Gaza, which many international specialists and organizations classify as a genocide, has considerably aggravated the attack on the academic freedom of Palestinians and those who speak out about Palestine and the Palestinian people. Government officials across the West have condemned anti-war protests, and Palestine-related events at several universities have been cancelled. Universities which have issued statements supporting Ukraine and Ukrainian students and members of staff remain silent or issue statements that fail to mention Gaza, Palestine, and Palestinians, aggravating their suffering. Recently, an event organized by academics at the Birmingham Law School was cancelled because the flyers included a watermelon emoji. This is not only happening in the academic field. Many artists and writers have been cancelled across the West, namely in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany, including Jewish descendants of victims of the Holocaust. And recently there was a case in Germany of Masha Gessener, who is descendant of victims of the Holocaust who saw her prize cancelled in Germany. And there is also the case of Adania Shibli, a Palestinian writer who had her award ceremony at the Frankfurt Book Fair cancelled. Moreover, most universities, academic organizations, and academic journals in the West failed to publicly speak out for a humanitarian ceasefire, the only measure that can put an immediate end to the massacre of Palestinians in Gaza. And so that's why we are here today. We need to find ways to speak out. We need to challenge the fears that we have and find alternatives. And as Edward Said, the late Palestinian intellectual Edward Said said, what is critical consciousness at bottom, if not an unstoppable predilection for alternatives? And so, without more delays, I will now introduce our first speaker. So, Rebecca Gould is a distinguished professor of comparative poetics and global politicals at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. Her creative and critical practice explores the poetics of politics and politics of poetry. Rebecca's work broadly traverses literary, political, and legal theory, with a particular emphasis on the literatures of the Islamic world and the Caucasus. Her scholarly articles have received awards ranging from the International Society for Intellectual History's Charles Smith Prize to the Women's Caucus for the Modern Languages Association's Florence Howe Award for Feminist Scholarship to the British Association of American Studies Arthur Miller Center Essay Prize. Rebecca is the author of Erasing Palestine, Free Speech and Palestinian Freedom. Rebecca, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Carlos, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's great to see such a significant turnout, and obviously that shows how many of us are affected by these issues, by the suppression of Palestine solidarity. So I'm just going to briefly talk about a few things. I'll talk about my own just personal experience of coming under pressure for my speech in relation to Palestine, and some case studies were shared with me. I have just a couple of comments on those, and then I thought it might be useful to kind of, I just a few minutes ago put together some kind of do's and don'ts, mostly just based on my own experience of what the pressures that we're all under. And yeah, and okay, so I will begin by talking about my own background. And I also want to kind of sort of begin by saying that I think all of us, many of us at least, including myself, remember a time in the UK when these pressures were not in place to nearly the same extent, where there was a considerable amount of, there could be an anti-apartheid week was allowed to go forward. You know, it wasn't met with such intense pushback. And that's a relatively recently, right? To be precise, before 2017. So that's not so long ago, and I think we can bring that back. That relative freedom. It's not the there's still space to push back, significant space. But yeah, so I arrived in the UK in 2017. About 5 years prior to that, I'd been living in Bethlehem in the West Bank. And when I arrived 5 years later in the UK, a student at the university, I was teaching at the University of Bristol. A student found an article I'd written that was critical of the occupation and of apartheid in Israel, and made a sort of media controversy about it. And then a university inquiry ensued this over the space of around 6 months. And what was important, I think, about this event was that it's still sort of relatively new in the crackdown on pro-Palestinian speech, because the IHRA definition had just been adopted 6 months. Oh, wait, and let me put my timer on. That's one thing I forgot to do. Yes. Had just been adopted a few months earlier in December, so 3 months earlier, by Theresa May's government. And so, yes, so it was really one of the first cases of an academic being criticized for their criticisms of Israel, being firing was being called for and so forth. That was relatively new. And it took place at the same time that there was a call to cancel Anti-Apartheid Week across the country, particularly at the University of Exeter. And so this was it was completely sort of unprepared for what was happening. There was no precedent, and I didn't quite know what was going on. But I reached out to my union and to, as well, very soon actually into the controversy, I reached out to a lawyer, Jamie Potter at Binmans. Hopefully some of you may have come across that law firm, because they've done incredible work in terms of supporting Palestinian rights. And yeah, so it's worth, I think it's okay for me to share his name, because he really was a lifesaver. And I think he's also lawyer for the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. I think he can be helpful to many people who are facing these issues. And yeah, so ultimately, I mean, I learned a few things. At the end of the day, I should just, to kind of give a kind of conclusion, I think I was, it was not a case of, I wasn't fired. The university did this sort of very confidential panel, which I was not a part of or even allowed to know who was participating in. And they reviewed my article and issued this like 3-page report about how, ultimately it wasn't anti-Semitic. But what was interesting was that they did use the IHRA definition very extensively at a time when it hadn't really been adopted. It hadn't been adopted by the University of Bristol, hadn't been widely adopted. And so that in itself was rather shocking. And one point I think that one aspect of my experience that resonates with some of the case studies that I've been shared with, repeat the name of the lawyer, Jamie Potter. Maybe I won't look at the chat, it's too distracting, but yeah, Jamie Potter, I can repeat that in questions as well. Yeah, sorry, confidentiality. So that I noticed that some of the case studies that were shared with me brought up the issue of, whenever these things happen, whenever there is some kind of controversy, the first thing the university does is try to make it secret, try to impose a ban of confidentiality on whoever is suspect. And I really think that is potentially one thing that everyone should be pushing back on a little bit. I think so in my case as well, even though ultimately at the end of the day, the university didn't see grounds for anti-Semitism in what was in the article that I'd written, they were very, very keen to, make everything as secret as possible, as if there was something to be ashamed of. And I would say in retrospect, I could have pushed back against that more. And I would say we should keep in mind that the university doesn't really have a legal right, to prevent us from speaking out. But I think what's important, I mean, from speaking from a practical perspective, when someone is placed in a position like that, where their employer is saying that they're not at liberty to share anything, that there's some kind of suspicion that's happening, I think it's obviously a good strategy would be to kind of be polite and you can show your willingness to go. I'm not advising anyone to go make trouble with their employer at an early stage, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that they cannot prevent you from speaking out, especially to lawyers and legal representatives. So I would say the first step that anyone should do when faced with any kind of accusation or allegation from their employer is to contact the ELSC, the European Legal Support Center, which has been they didn't exist at the time when I came under attack, so I did reach out to other lawyers. But that's an example of there's really no reason not to contact them. Let me put it that way, and no prescription that any employer can put on you can ever be a basis for not speaking with people, legal advocates, right? Also, speaking to one's union, I think is really helpful and really necessary. But the thing about the union, and this is just again from my experience, and I think it varies across different universities, but in my case at the University of Bristol, the union's priority first and foremost is to protect employees, which is obviously really important and really necessary, to protect them, to prevent you from being fired. But what's different about, say, an organization like that versus the ELSC, which is dedicated to supporting the right to speak out in solidarity with Palestine, is that they also have an investment in protecting your ability to speak out as well as to keep your job. I think a union may be more likely to kind of encourage neutrality on the issue, which can be useful in certain contexts from the point of view of self-preservation. But I would say if you have a lawyer involved, such as the ELSC or Binmans or whatever, then they're incentivized, or they're thinking of the issue from your perspective, not just from the perspective of your protecting your job, but of protecting the ability to speak out as such. So it should be someone who is very informed and committed to Palestine issues. And there are lots of lawyers, and I think one reason why people don't they kind of wait too long to look for legal support. I mean, well, first of all, maybe they don't know about the ELSC, or it's been growing a lot stronger recently, but maybe they're afraid of it being too expensive or something like that. But I think it's useful to just form relations. There are a lot of lawyers who have publicly said that they should be contacted and are happy to be contacted pro bono in cases of employment discrimination relating to Palestine. So I think it's just keep a list of those people and stay in touch with them, and stay in touch with to support the ELSC. And then if a moment comes when you need their support, it's a lot easier to just reach out quickly to them. So that would be sort of one lesson from my experience. I'm going through my list here. And yes, and the other point I would make is that always, I think after whatever incident or whatever it is has kind of reached a conclusion, it is really imperative, not just for your own sake, but for the sake of preserving the space for everyone, to do a freedom of information request, a subject access request. And I will give the example of a case like at the University of Central Lancashire. That was one of the first examples, perhaps the first example of a pro-Palestine anti-apartheid event being canceled using the IHRA definition, and it caused a huge coverage, a scandal in the media. It got a lot of attention, but the only reason that it was known why that cancellation took place was because of a freedom of information request. Because universities always, they have their whatever security protocols, the health and safety measures. They're always going to have an excuse about why they cancel someone, why they suppress someone, right? And usually that excuse is they're going to try to make that into something that's not controversial. But if the email correspondence that's not made published, reveals that actually it was a case of, say, applying the IHRA definition or whatever it is, that needs to be brought to the public domain and the public record. So I think it's really imperative. And in cases of also of academics being suppressed, like in my case as well, as I said, I at the end of the day, I wasn't fired or penalized or disciplined. But when I did do a subject access request, I uncovered a lot of information, that wasn't shown to me and wasn't revealed to me, documents that weren't disclosed, letters written by the Board of Deputies that weren't disclosed to me. And so I think it just, and that's really important, for the world to see, not just for my own sake. So I think that should be seen as an imperative. But the other side of that, of course, is be aware that that's a legal tool that can also be used against us, right? And so if the freedom of information, a lot of these Israel advocacy campaigns also engage in that. So our emails, can at any point be requested or subpoenaed or whatever. So I would also encourage people, not to use university email for anything related to Palestine, or just in general, anything at all, because it's university property, and the university retains the right at any point to read it, to hand it over to anyone who is curious, basically. So that's just something to keep in mind. Another practical lesson that that was one of the first things my lawyer told me, actually. That was really good advice. And yes, and also just, looking a little bit more broadly about the sort of state of the definitional world we live in, which again, it wasn't quite, this is all very new in terms of the history of thinking about racism and anti-Semitism. So I think many of you and on this webinar will be familiar with the JDA, right? Which, as I understand, was adopted at the same time as the IHRA definition. And I think you should be congratulated. I mean, as an institution, as a university, for fighting the single adoption of the IHRA definition. And I know I'm also just raising that because I know that the next speaker is going to discuss the JDA in a little bit more detail. And I understand that there have been some cases where having the JDA in place has been a kind of lifesaver. It's saved people from disciplinary action. So that's all very, I think, positive. I guess I would just, so there's going to be more detailed discussion of that later. I guess I would just kind of caveat it that I think that the JDA itself was always only ever intended as a kind of pushback against the IHRA, right? And so I certainly can imagine a world of bad faith actors in which that would also, the JDA, even though it was created, for good reasons, it could also be used to punish people. So I guess I think any kind of approach to dealing with racism or anti-Semitism that relies heavily on these definitions, I think, is fraught with danger. I guess that's kind of a lesson I learned, because I kind of saw that the way any definition could be manipulated. And I think the JDA is it's a universe better than the IHRA. That's just something to keep in mind. I think ultimately, Ideally, we would be working for moving away from that whole definitional approach in general over the long term. And sorry, yes, Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism. And I guess yeah, so maybe I'll just conclude with some of the kind of summary of do's and don'ts that I, based on my own experience of being attacked and pushing back and talking to lots of people who have been in that situation. It's a kind of simplistic way to put it, but I think maybe it's useful because it, puts into hopefully very practical terms. So I would say, as far as do's go, do speak to a lawyer at the earliest stage of this process. Make friends with lawyers, develop a relationship with and support the ELSC. Have lawyers in your life whom you can contact in need. Do place subject access and FOI requests. Be aware that these can be used against you. Do speak to everyone you possibly can about it. And I do understand that in a kind of internal university context, if your employer, makes you feel like you should be keeping all this confidential, there are probably good reasons not to speak to your immediate colleagues, but speaking to groups like Brickup, speaking at, off-campus meetings, I think that's all very essential. And the truth is, and again, this is definitely not legal advice, but just my own experience is that, they're not going to find out. I think you only benefit from sharing your experience. And there really is no legal basis, for imposing confidentiality in those kinds of ways, in those kinds of contexts. It's really the only thing that should keep you back from speaking of your experience is really shame, so don't do anything stupid. If you say something that you're ashamed of, then yes, there's reasons, but I think other than that, there's not a reason. And do record all meetings and exchanges in writing with details of time and place. Do be respectful and professional, express their willingness to collaborate. And then as far as just don'ts, as I've said, don't overestimate the university's powers to impose confidentiality on you, only if you've legally agreed to a non-disclosure agreement. That's the only case in which there's a legal obligation to be confidential. Otherwise, you haven't agreed to it, so they can't impose confidentiality. Don't say anything you wouldn't be ashamed of and not willing to defend yourself against publicly. Don't use university email. Don't put personal data on university devices. Don't keep repression of pro-Palestine speech to yourself. And most importantly, and I'll end here, don't let the repression of Palestine solidarity stop your solidarity with Palestine. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was great, and lots that you've shared are really practical steps that will be helpful for colleagues who felt silenced or unable to speak around this issue. So thank you so much. Okay, I'm delighted now to introduce the next speaker. Kristina Hultgren holds a DPhil from the University of Oxford and a certificate in public policy analysis from the London School of Economics and Political Science. She is Professor of Sociolinguistics and UKRI Future Leaders Fellow at the Open University, where she is currently leading a 4-year interdisciplinary project funded with £1.4 million under a UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship. The project traces decision-making processes in higher education governance across Europe. Kristina was also an OU Senate member at the time when the university's definition of anti-Semitism was discussed. Over to you, Kristina.
Thank you, Lina. Let's just see if I can share my screen here. Can you see this?
Yes, if you can just go, that's perfect, Kristina. Good to go.
Is that okay? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so thank you very much for that. So to start off, I should make clear that I cannot claim any expertise in the Israel-Palestine issue. I speak as an ex-Senate member who helped ensure that the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, or JDA, was, oops, sorry, getting ahead of myself, was
Kristina,
added.
sorry, just to interrupt, we can, I think we can see your notes as well, so.
You can see the notes, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Let me just try again.
Yes, that's perfect.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so to start off, I should make clear that I cannot claim any expertise in the Israel-Palestine issue. I speak as an ex-Senate member who helped ensure that the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, or JDA, was added to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA working definition on anti-Semitism. And because of that, I'm pleased to say that the OU has one of the most robust frameworks in place of any university in the UK to safeguard our Jewish staff and students against anti-Semitic abuse, while still protecting a space for debate around political issues. So this is an outline of my talk. Sorry. First, I'm going to talk about the definitions. Then I'm going to talk about the process as the motions went through the OU's governance structures from proposition to approval. I'll then talk about the debate in Senate and the key arguments that were put forth for and against different definitions. And then I'll state the outcome before I offer a couple of thoughts on the future. So first of all, the definitions. Because I only have time to highlight the key differences between these two definitions, I strongly encourage you, if you haven't already done so, to actually read these definitions in full and compare them for yourselves. Jaspal will paste the link in the chat for you to do so you can do that at your own time after the webinar. The IHRA definition essentially has been said to be comparatively vague and open to interpretation, and a key point of contention is the extent to which it is possible to criticize the actions of Israel as a state without being labeled as anti-Semitic. The JDA has been written specifically to address that point by seeking to offer greater clarity. It is comparatively more precise and nuanced and distinguishes clearly between what may, on the face of it, be anti-Semitic and what is, on the face of it, not anti-Semitic. So just to give you a couple of examples, it is anti-Semitic to hold Jews collectively responsible for Israel's conduct or to treat Jews simply because they are Jewish as agents of Israel. In contrast, it is not anti-Semitic to support the Palestinian demand for justice or to engage in evidence-based criticism of Israel as a state. That was the key differences between the two definitions, but please do read them for yourselves as well, so you can make up your own mind about what the differences are. And I'll now go on to the process. So on the agenda of the Senate meeting of the 27th of January, 2021, was a motion to discuss and recommend to Council the definition of anti-Semitism. We were informed that a request had come from the then Secretary of State for Education, Gavin Williamson, that all universities should adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. 3 options were put to us: that the university adopt the definition and examples in full, that the university does not adopt the definition and relies on existing anti-racism policies to afford protection for all, or that the university adopts the definition but with caveats, the caveat recommended by the Home Affairs Select Committee that it is not anti-Semitic to hold the Israeli government to to the same standards as other liberal democracies, or to take a particular interest in the Israeli government's policies or actions without additional evidence to suggest anti-Semitic intent. Senate decided that more information and consultation with staff and students was needed before a recommendation could be made because of the divergent issues or the divergent views on the issue. So the decision was deferred to our next meeting on the 21st of April. In the interim, OU staff were provided with a webpage with resources and an online forum to which all OU staff members were invited to contribute. Prior to the next Senate meeting on the 21st of April, 2021, the motion with the 3 options, which had originally come through to us through the Education Committee, had been withdrawn and replaced by one other option, which was to adopt the IHRA definition in full. Meeting minutes from the Education Committee suggest that one reason why the 3 options were withdrawn was that members got hung up on the words anti-Semitic intent in the caveat, which was felt to go against the OU's existing bullying and harassment policies that prioritize the victim's feelings over the perpetrator's intent. And questions were also raised over how to evidence intent. In addition to being asked to adopt the IHRA definition in full, an amendment to this motion had also been received in the interim, namely to adopt the JDA, not instead of, but in addition to the IHRA definition, in order to, and I cite, accompany, clarify, and reinforce the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Senate voted first on the amendment, which was carried by an overwhelming majority, and we then also voted on the adoption of both the IHRA definition and the JDA definition, and the JDA, and this was also carried by an overwhelming majority. Senate's recommendation to adopt both definitions was then approved by Council, and it is worth noting that the Council explicitly acknowledged the depth and breadth of the debate at Senate on the issue. That was the process. Let's take a look now at the debate and the arguments for and against. This is drawn from a combination of minutes from the meetings in the Education Committee, the Senate, and the Council, all of which are available to internal OU staff and students, so my account can be verified there. If you want to send the link, Jaspal, you can do so to the Senate website. I've also drawn on the discussion in the online forum, which has since been closed, but I still have access to the notifications, and on my own recollection at the Senate debate. The arguments that were put forth in favor of the IHRA definition was that anti-Semitism is on the rise and universities are not doing enough to tackle it. It was also said that existing legislation is unfit to recognize and counter the many modern day forms of anti-Semitism, and that an adoption would send a powerful message of support to our Jewish staff and students. The main argument for adopting both definitions was that it would counter the perceived conflation of anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel. Only having the IHRA definition, on the other hand, was argued to potentially lead to self-censorship and deter people from criticizing the state of Israel for fear of being accused of being anti-Semitic. It was further argued that having both definitions would counter curtailment of academic freedom. Only having the IHRA definition, on the other hand, was argued to potentially make staff fearful of teaching certain subjects, using certain texts, or voicing criticism of Israel's actions. It was also argued that the vagueness of the IHRA definition on its own could cause confusion and weaken the fight against anti-Semitism. In a similar vein, it was argued that adopting both definitions would help counter false accusations of anti-Semitism and leave the definition less open to misuse. It was argued that the IHRA definition had not been developed for a university context and that its author was opposed to it being used for an unintended purpose. Conversely, it was argued that greater care had been put into the JDA, which had been written over a year by an international consortium of leading scholars on anti-Semitism. So there were more, and in my view, stronger arguments in favor of adopting both definitions. And this is also reflected in the fact that this was the motion that was agreed by an overwhelming majority in Senate. Some questions were also posed and answered during the debate. So for instance, how will the definitions be used? And it was made clear to us that they would be used as guidance, for instance, when investigating complaints or to supplement existing policies. It was also asked, what does adopt mean? It was said that the definitions would be set in the context of both the Equality Act and the Statement of Principles on Academic Freedom, both of which would take precedence. It was asked, I've got my pictures in the way of my slide. It was asked if adopting both definitions would actually conflict. And it was said that the JDA explicitly states that it could be used as a tool for interpreting the IHRA definition in areas where the IHRA definition was not sufficiently clear. And then there was also a question as to whether the university should also adopt the all-party parliamentary group's definition of Islamophobia. To my knowledge, that has still not been proposed as a motion. So on now to the outcome. So the outcome of the Senate debate was that the OU now has formally adopted both the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and the JDA. And you can read about that here on the OU policy site, and Jaspal will share the link in the chat. The web page also makes clear the OU's legal commitment to the Equality Act and the statement of principles on academic freedom. And I would very much encourage you all to read and engage with all of these policies, because in combination, they provide clear guidance on how to go about debating these complex politicized issues with both integrity and sensitivity. And I'd like to pay tribute to our Vice Chancellor, Tim Blackman, who was exemplary in chairing the debate in Senate. He played a key role throughout, stressing the importance of balancing equality with academic freedom. And I even personally thanked him afterwards in an email, praising him for how he had chaired the debate with both integrity and sensitivity, thus embodying both of those core university values. So how about the future then, going forward? There's no doubt the universities today, and not only the OU, face significant challenges in balancing their legal commitment to the Equality Act with their legal commitment to academic freedom. Both are clearly of utmost importance, as our VC made abundantly clear in the Senate debate. It can be tempting when it comes to highly politicized topics to stay clear of debate for fear of not causing offense and not hurting anyone. I must admit that I myself had some reservations when asked if I would speak at this seminar. Eventually, I decided it was too important not to, and that it is especially when it comes to highly politicized topics and when lives are being lost, that it is essential to speak out. If we don't do this, then how else can different viewpoints be put forth and governments be held to account? Universities are arguably one of the most important places in which to do this. I cite here from the Statement of Principles on Academic Freedom. By being places of debate, universities are one of our most important pillars of civil society and represent a safeguard against forces that divide and undermine society. If universities are to be the innovative and dynamic organizations that push back the boundaries of knowledge in areas of science, social science, and the humanities, they must also be places where differing and difficult views can be brought forward, listened to, and challenged. The principles make clear that as long as our views are put forward in a manner that is respectful of others and without being hostile or degrading, we are protected within the law to put forth our views. It is also worth bearing in mind that our university has a legal duty not only to protect academic freedom, but to be proactive in protecting academic freedom for ourselves and for others, and to use it responsibly for the promotion of knowledge and understanding. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kristina. I think that this was very important to clarify the process when this issue was debated at the Senate, and also to clarify how this helps people to know how to navigate the situation when they want to speak and to know more about this. So I will now introduce our next speaker, Les Levidow, who is a Senior Research Fellow, Development Policy and Practice at the Open University. His research has focused on public controversies over techno-scientific developments, most recently around divergent development agendas in Latin America. Struggles there feature neo-colonial dispossession versus decolonial resistance, the latter including the agroecology-based solidarity economy. As a political activist, Les has published many articles about Israel-Palestine, including false allegations of anti-Semitism. For the past decade, he has been an active member of the British Committee for the Universities of Palestine. Since the 80s, he has been actively involved in Jewish anti-Zionist groups. Over to you, Les.
Okay, thanks for the introduction. So you see the title, The Israel-Palestine Issue as Rival Narratives at the OU and Beyond. And the PowerPoint file is mainly a sketch without much detailed text, but This tells you where I am in the overall talk. So the next slide gives you a brief outline with the questions that I will cover in my short time here. How has this issue come to the OU? What are the rival narratives? Which elements have been favored or discouraged? How to create a space for free academic debate. And the next slide just gives you a brief outline. So you can read. I won't read it out. So now we go on to the first section. Yeah, before October. So at many universities over the past decade or more, student groups have been raising critical issues such as climate change and Israel-Palestine, in turn stimulating staff debates. By contrast with most universities, the OU campus has no undergraduates to play that role. Before October, the Israel-Palestine issue arose mainly in pro-Palestine motions to the UCU branch, hardly affecting staff in general. The issue arose indirectly at the OU when a 2021 Senate motion proposed to adopt the IHRA definition, and Kristina has explained very well how that debate played out, with the result of protecting academic freedom on these issues. As the wider context, pro-Palestine views have been regularly stigmatized on several grounds, especially for causing unease among Jews or even for being anti-Semitic. This political agenda stereotypes Jews as pro-Israel by conflating anti-Semitism with anti-Israel criticism, as in the IHRA misdefinition, I call it. This conflation deters such criticism, forecloses the issue of what is or isn't anti-Semitic, serves Israel's impunity for international law, and so facilitates its regular violations of human rights and international law. There's been a long time intimidation of pro-Palestine academics, which has intensified in the last few years. The OU administration has rarely commented on international issues in general, though an exception has been Russia's attack on Ukraine. For several decades, the administration said nothing about the Israel-Palestine. It remained silent, for example, about Israel's large-scale settlement expansion, its land thefts, its house demolitions, its Gaza siege since 2007, its massacres killing thousands of Palestinians there, especially in 2008 and again in 2014, its widespread detention of Palestinian hostages, numbering thousands on the West Bank, and many other violations of international law. After Hamas carried out its 7th October cross-border attack, resulting in over 1,200 Israeli deaths, Israel renewed its previous attacks on Gaza. By mid-October, Israeli bombs had killed hundreds, perhaps thousands. Finally, then, the OU Communications Unit, OU Comms for short, broke its silence on Israel-Palestine. Why then, and exactly how? It made two statements, the first on 13th October and the second on 16th October. The statements were mainly about the welfare of Palestinian and Israeli staff or students who may be directly affected by the Gaza violence, and rightly so. But let us ask, how well did it fulfill that role, and especially for everyone who was directly affected? The first part of the statement on the 16th October was about the violence per se. OU Comms received email message criticizing the first part as one-sided. So we can move on to the next slide. And in response to those criticisms, it was somewhat revised. So let's apply academic methods of discourse analysis to highlight some assumptions and emphases which might otherwise remain implicit. So you can see the final version on the screen there. You can read it for yourself. And in response to criticisms, that version had added some phrases and the subsequent military response from Israel, and as well as the phrase "and Islamophobia." Both those phrases were missing from the original version. We should ask why they were missing. Beyond those details, here are the fundamental questions. Why did the OU issue a statement on Israel-Palestine in mid-October? And in that statement, whose lives and detentions mattered? Even as amended, the statement implies that the main victim has been Israel, and that it has been at war against Hamas, as in the title, not against Gazans in general. And how to describe Hamas? Let's consider a comparison with the BBC, which has undergone intense government pressure to call Hamas terrorists. It has resisted the pressure, instead calling them fighters or militants. By contrast, the OU statement uses the politically loaded term, while not applying the term terrorist symmetrically to the Israeli military. And what about the detainees on both sides? The term hostages is applied only to Israelis, not Palestinians. They merely have a problem of welfare and suffering, vaguely caused by the Israeli response, as it says in the statement. In several respects, this language replicates the dominant political agenda, the joint narrative of the US, UK, and Israeli governments. This narrative is a long-time trope of colonial and neo-colonial regimes, which invert the roles of the colonial perpetrator and its colonized victim, as I will explain more later as regards narratives. But for now, let's continue the story about the OU statement. The web link was circulated by the graduate school to all PhD students and supervisors. The statement made some PhD students feel intimidated and discouraged from discussing these issues with academic colleagues, partly for the reasons I explained. Some complainants received a response saying that the statement, quote, is balanced and recognizing both the suffering of the Israeli people targeted by the Hamas attacks and the Palestinian people in Gaza, end quote. Palestinians targeted by whom? By what means? Silence. Meanwhile, pogroms in the West Bank had begun long before 7th October and intensified afterwards, but silence in the statement. Overall, the statement was balanced. According to the OU's principles of academic freedom, we will be proactive in protecting academic freedom, etc. Well, this was respected by adding the JDA to the pro-HRA motion in the Senate 2 years ago. However, the OU statement should be seen as preemptive rather than proactive. When reading the second statement, many staff members felt disappointment, offense, even outrage, as well as anxiety. Now move on to UCRI slide. The anxiety was soon compounded nationally by UCRI, that is UK Research and Innovation. In late October, 2 members of Research England's EDI advisory group, that's Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion, were publicly criticized for so-called extremist views, that is, for pro-Palestine posts on social media. The education minister reinforced the criticism of the 2 advisors and demanded action from Ukraine. Its director cravenly complied by suspending the EDI advisory group. The suspension provoked widespread condemnation from university staff. A petition soon gained 3,000 signatures. These included OU academics who had dealt with the panel members as colleagues, and so perhaps felt a special threat to academic freedom, including themselves. That episode raised the academic stakes for the politically loaded term extremist, which serves as a central concept in the program Preventing Violent Extremism, and which in turn serves to prevent debate rather than violence. But that would need an entire talk in its own right. So I'll move on now to rival narratives, the next slide, of Israel-Palestine violence. As the bigger picture, what debate is being precluded or discouraged? On many issues, academic analysis has identified rival framings, problem definitions, storylines, narratives, and so on. These concepts can be linked with decolonial perspectives, as I will try to do briefly here. So let us ask, how has the Israel-Palestine issue generated rival narratives, even about what to call the issue? For example, it has been variously called a conflict, well, between what and what? Between rival claims on the land by two peoples, or alternatively, a conflict between Palestinian terrorism versus Israeli counterterrorism and broader security measures, or alternatively, between the Jewish supremacist settler colonial apartheid regime modeled after the white supremacy of European settler colonial regimes, all of which generated anti-colonial resistance, as in Palestine today. Next kind of question, is the Gaza violence a war against Hamas or against all Gazans? Is it a defensive war or else ethnic cleansing, expulsion, and genocide? Why does the Israeli Defense Force, IDF, use AI systems to target armed combatants more precisely, or else to target hospitals, schools, and key professionals, such as journalists, medics, and academics? After the 7th October Hamas attack, Israel denounced any narrative indicating an earlier history of the issue, such as a statement by the UN Secretary General. So let's survey some rival narratives about when, how, and why the problem started. According to various narratives, going back in history, this will be a brief sketch. It started with, well, Hamas's cross-border attack in October, according to the Israeli narrative, or perhaps it started with the 2022 Israeli general election, resulting in a new finance minister who had told Palestinian members of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, quote, "You are here by mistake because Ben-Gurion didn't finish the job and throw you out in 1948. And of course, his party was elected to finish the job. Also, the government's new national security minister had been convicted of inciting anti-Arab racism and supporting a terrorist organization. We can go back further in history, Israel's ongoing siege of Gaza since 2007, or going back 2 decades, a decade earlier, the Likud Party's 1997 election platform, which undertook that between the river and the sea, a familiar slogan, there would be only Jewish sovereignty, which rhymes, especially today. Or go back further, Israel's 1967 occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, or go back to Israel's 1948 independence war, also known as the Nakba, the catastrophe in Arabic, displacing 750 Palestinians, or go back to Britain's partition plan, provoking the 1936-39 Palestinian revolt, which was jointly suppressed by the British Army and the incipient Zionist army, or go back to the 1917 Balfour Declaration, promising a Jewish homeland, Palestine, which is a euphemism for a supremacist Jewish state. Or go back to the 1897 First Zionist Congress, which said Zionism aims at establishing for the Jewish people a publicly and legally assured home in Palestine. Of course, the Jews already living there had a secure home, but this was a euphemism for an exclusively Jewish state. Or go back to 19th century Christian Zionism, which promoted Jewish immigration to the Holy Land to bring about the return of Jesus and the rapture. According to Christian Zionists back then, Palestine was a land without a people, for a people without a land. A well-known slogan today, but its history is not well known. Given that Israel calls itself the state of world Jewry, how is the state relevant to anti-Semitism? According to rival narratives, Israel calls itself this a necessary state safe refuge from anti-Semitism. Therefore, any opposition to the Israeli state is anti-Semitic. According to a rival narrative, the Israeli state is an institutionally racist endeavor, degrading the Jewish legacy of social justice. Moreover, conflating anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism is a racist stereotype of Jews, as if they all identify with Israel. This deploys a state philo-Semitism as a shield for Israel and its Western supporters, in the guise of opposing anti-Semitism. So I'll stop the narratives there, but now move on to the final slide about institutional roles. So given those rival narratives, how have some been demonized, intimidated, or silenced? Through what political pressures? Which narratives are accepted or even internalized by university administrations? Which narratives are questioned or constrained by them? Through what means? Euphemisms, bureaucratic disguises, disciplinary procedures? how to link decolonial perspectives with discourse analysis and perhaps other academic methods. All those questions warrant academic debate. It should be promoted by the OU's academic units. How to stimulate such a debate, to discuss. I conclude there. Thanks for listening.
Hey, thank you very much, Les, for that excellent critical analysis of how the issue has come to the OU, and that presentation of the rival narratives. Very thought-provoking. So we do now have time for questions and answers.